The autonomic nervous system can sometimes be called the visceral nervous system. And this is because the neurons of the autonomic nervous system, they innervate our squishy organs. Yeah, I mean, they're all squishy, but you know what I mean. The ANS, or autonomic nervous system, it's a motor system. It's an output system, including only outgoing neurons from the CNS, or central nervous system. We have previously discovered that motor neurons innervate skeletal muscle and release acetylcholine to excite the muscle. And that was the somatic nervous system. We may not have called it that at the time, but that is the somatic nervous system. Here in the autonomic nervous system, neurons innervate cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. And they excite those effectors by using acetylcholine and norepinephrine. So now we're getting a little bit more complicated. You might be thinking that these autonomic neurons fully control these visceral organs. Untrue. These organs usually have their own ways of establishing a baseline activity. For example, in the heart, there are pacemaker cells that establish a baseline heart rate. There's a baroreceptor, a pressure receptor in your aorta that senses the pressure of the blood coming from the heart as it pumps. This baroreceptor is connected, dun, 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 sorry, it's connected to cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and this nerve travels to the medulla oblongata and synapses with an interneuron. Remember, interneurons are fully within the central nervous system, and in this case, this interneuron evaluates the incoming pressure information and determines an appropriate output. And this output, it leaves the medulla oblongata by way of cranial nerve 10, and this nerve travels to the heart where it adjusts the firing of the pacemaker cells. Just as with somatic reflexes, we have visceral reflexes. And these reflexes, they are much slower response than the somatic reflexes we've previously discussed. Right? We discussed the withdrawal reflex, the cross extensor reflex, and those somatic reflexes happen very quickly. So somatic reflexes and visceral reflexes, they can use the same sensory receptors, right? They can use the same unipolar sensory neurons. For example, thermoreceptors in the skin of your hand can sense that you are burning your hand on a hot surface. And though that reflex can cause the withdrawal using your skeletal muscles, and that's a somatic reflex. A visceral reflex may also use thermoreceptors, most likely embedded in a visceral neuron, but instead of activating skeletal somatic tissues or skeletal muscle, visceral reflexes activate smooth or cardiac muscle or glands. And these items, these three things, are known as the effectors of visceral reflexes. This motor neuron will be a neuron of the autonomic nervous system instead of a neuron of the somatic nervous system. Oh, yeah, let's take a moment to review the output of somatic motor system, which activates skeletal muscles. In this case that we've seen previously, there's commonly one multipolar neuron that originates in the primary somatic motor cortex. And this motor neuron, it descends the spinal cord in a motor tract, and it leaves the spinal cord by way of the ventral root, spinal nerve, and the ventral ramus. How far does this go? There we go. Therefore, this one motor neuron then reaches all the way from the brain to the skeletal muscle. And at the junction of the neuron and the skeletal muscle, called the neuromuscular junction, The motor neuron uses acetylcholine to excite the skeletal muscle. Let's note that. ACH. That's awkward. There are other examples of somatic motor output that involve two neurons, and we would have one neuron leaving the primary motor somatic cortex of the brain and descending the spinal cord, and then at the appropriate level, that motor neuron would synapse with another neuron that leaves the spinal cord and travels all the way to the skeletal muscle where ACH is used to excite it. In that case, we had named the neuron stretching from the brain to the spinal cord an upper motor neuron, and the one that then stretched all the way to the skeletal muscle was called a lower motor neuron. That is the somatic motor system. We want to look at the autonomic nervous system, which uses two neurons for output. And for our examples in this class, the neurons will not originate in the brain, at least right now. They're going to originate in the lateral horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. And as you might recall, that lateral horn was designated as an area of synapse for visceral motor neurons. So then a neuron leaves the spinal cord by way of the ventral root, travels through the spinal nerve, goes through a ventral ramus, and it outputs to a structure that is called a ganglion. A ganglion is simply an area of synapse. It's an area of synapse that's not in the spinal cord. It's, out further. At this ganglion, that first neuron synapses with a second neuron. And that neuron then travels all the way to the target cell or the effectors. And as you can see here, we have our three effectors of the autonomic nervous system: smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. The two neurons are given names in reference to their location to the ganglion. The preganglionic fiber occurs in sequence before the ganglion, and the postganglionic fiber occurs in sequence after it. These can sometimes be referred to as the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons. Either, doesn't matter. It's the same thing for us at this level. Before in the nervous system, we called these the presynaptic and postsynaptic neurons, but we are now in the autonomic nervous system, and it is more appropriate to refer to the location of the ganglion that contains the synapse. While the gray matter of the spinal cord houses our synapses that occur within the central nervous system, a ganglion, as I just said, houses synapses that are outside the central nervous system. These little bubbles here in the nerves, these little bubbles, these are the ganglia. Right there, there's tons more. Ooh, all of these. A ganglion contains the axon terminal of the preganglionic fiber, and it contains the cell body, and let's draw some of this, axon terminals of a preganglionic fiber, and the cell body of a postganglionic fiber. And a ganglion, it can simply be one synapse between fibers, but that's a gross oversimplification. Usually these are what are called nerve plexuses associated with a ganglion, and it houses many synapses. There are a lot of ganglia located right next to the spinal cord, and it's these two extra spinal cords of gray matter on either side of the real spinal cord, right? It's kind of weird to think of it like that. These structures, they're lateral to the spinal cord, and they're called the sympathetic chain ganglia. There are also ganglia located further out in visceral organs, and these are called the celiac, supramesenteric, and inferior mesenteric ganglia. These terms, mesentery, it refers to this connective tissue sheet of fat, nerves, and vessels that kind of like binds all of your intestines together. The The autonomic nervous system is a system in and of itself that is separate and different than the somatic nervous system we previously discussed. Within the autonomic nervous system, there are two divisions that have classically been recognized, but there is now a third division that is starting to be included among the divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Here is just a brief summary. And there are lectures that go into much more detail on the first two divisions. The sympathetic nervous system, also called the thoracolumbar system, owing to its original origins of the, listen to this, owing to the origins of the postganglionic fibers in the thoracic and lumbar sections of your spinal cord. This is the division that functionally takes over when you feel threatened, stressed, or anxious. This system mobilizes you to either fight or flight. And recently in my courses, students have also suggested that this system can make you freeze. Okay, agreed. The parasympathetic nervous system is also called the cranial sacral nervous system, owing to the origin of the postganglionic fibers in the sacral region and of the cranial nerves. So this is the system that's hopefully in control for you all of the time and is helping you to rest and digest. Stress and anxiety can cause the sympathetic nervous system to override the parasympathetic, leading to many of the physical symptoms of stress, such as gastrointestinal distress and high blood pressure, both of which I have. The enteric nervous system has been newly recognized as a third option or third division within the sympathetic nervous system. The enteric nervous system it's your gut brain. It is the digestive nervous system, and yes, it regulates itself. It has reflexes that don't even go through the spinal cord. It has reflexes of like the stomach feeding back to the small intestine.